Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ganesh Ramachandran. I am a co-chair of the Housing Committee for the BSA with Sarah Kudra from the DREAM Collaborative. I am a planner, Deputy Director of Planning at DCAM, and we have with us Amy Dane and Chris Kletchman. Amy is a consultant and a public policy researcher and a writer. For those who haven't seen her series of articles in the Commonwealth magazine on the MBTA zoning, I strongly encourage you to take a look at that if you get a chance. And she, in 2008, she launched the StatNet initiative, a community of practice for municipal managers interested in data-driven decision-making. And she's a grad from the Harvard Kennedy School. Chris Kletchman is the Deputy Director of the Community Services Division at DHCD. I guess I don't have to explain what DHCD for everyone here, preaching to the choir, Department of Housing and Community Development. And she oversees and coordinates programs in the Community Services Division, including land use, economic development, and technical assistance program. And she has been on this roadshow for a while. So I'm super thrilled that she has offered to spare her time with us. So without further ado, I will let Chris start and let me share the PowerPoint. Give me a minute here.
Thank you so much, Ganesh and Sarah. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with Amy, who's so articulate. I'm happy to share this presentation. I've sent the BSA folks a PDF of it so they can share it with you. It is going to be rapid and fast because there's a lot of information to try and convey in a short amount of time. So let's just get right to the next slide. The other thing that I would add is that this is a new presentation. And so for those of you who may have seen the roadshow, this is a little bit different. I finally added some more photos and made it a little more interesting. So this is what I plan to try and cover, give you some resources and why we have the law. What is it? Who is it for? What are the basic requirements? Some clarifications and final contact information. Let's go to the next. So the MBTA Communities Law was actually part of the Economic Development Bond Bill, and it was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor in great part, to try and address our housing crisis. If you've read any of Amy's research, you'll know, and I think here I'm quoting Amy actually directly in italics, that multifamily development in the greater Boston region has been very difficult to do. It's often done through special permit processes that can last for a long time, or rezoning, or a 40B project. And so that's just not the most effective way to get multifamily development that we need to support our growing population. This Section 3A of the Zoning Act, we hope it's a new paradigm and really creates, and I hope, if we have enough participation, success for me is we actually move the needle on production and we also change the market to make land zoned for multifamily more affordable, like for example, for community development corporations. And of course, we want to create good neighborhoods. And we'll talk about some of that in the details of the compliance guidelines. This website is what I would just keep coming. Sorry, Ganesh. I'll just, you want to bookmark this website and keep going back to it. It's full of resources, the guidelines, all of the information that you ever kind of want to know. Thanks. Next, Ganesh. So just to remind us, here's a short timeline. It's been 2 years, but it feels like a little more sometimes. 2021 in January, the governor signed the bill. We created draft guidelines in December of 2021. Those received extensive coverage in the news and feedback from the public and municipalities. We made pretty significant revisions and issued the guidelines in August. We had a brief revision in October. And then created a compliance model. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we've just passed one of the first milestones of the program, which is the compliance guidelines required the communities to submit an action plan. We're very happy that 98% of the municipalities did create an action plan, and they were very thoughtful about them. I want to add, you'll hear, we talk a lot about the 175. It's, as of January 1st, it's 177. Fall River and New Bedford are the newest MBTA communities. They voted by referendum to join the district. Next. So this is the most text-heavy slide I'll have. This is actually the entirety of the statute that was added into Section 3A by that Economic Development Bond Bill. The first paragraph establishes the basic outlines: multifamily housing by right, 15 units an acre, suitable for families with children, and if there is transit, near transit. The second paragraph talks about the penalties, which is lack of eligibility for certain funding mechanisms that the state has. And then the third paragraph directed my agency to work with MassDOT and MBTA and develop the guidelines. So this is what we had to use. And then of course we had to add lots of detail in the guidelines. And now I'm going to go over some of those requirements. Next slide. So first of all, what is an MBTA community? So again, as I mentioned, there's now 177 cities and towns that are actually named in a separate statute in Chapter 161A. If they're not listed there, they've taken another action to join. Again, like Fall River in New Bedford had a local referendum and became MBTA communities. So we have also the guidelines, and our basic approach has divided these into four community categories. We have rapid transit, commuter rail, adjacent, and then adjacent small towns. And you can see the number of communities here. You'll see in later slides, this is a general organizing principle. And we made some changes to these categories from the draft guidelines to the final, eliminating a bus category and breaking out small towns as communities that have less municipal capacity. And although they're adjacent to transit assets, they don't necessarily have transit access. Next slide. So when we're talking about this zoning, I want to take a minute and talk about for what and for whom. So it is sometimes a misnomer by some folks who don't like this law that this is all going to be high density residential. And I want to be really clear here. What we're talking about is commonly known in our profession as the missing middle. And with apologies to Opticos, I've changed their design here to reflect the Boston area famous triple decker as opposed to something that they call triple stacked. But what we're talking about in 3A is generally this missing middle. Not detached single family and not medium or high rise buildings. Not all of these will result in 15 units an acre, but generally this is the kind of development that we're talking about. The missing middle in my mind is not just a building type, it is also the middle income residents. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is crack the housing crisis that makes housing so unaffordable in Massachusetts. And while we don't have enough, we do have housing reserve for the very low and extremely low income. And it's the folks kind of in the middle who, unless you already owned a home, you may not be able to purchase a home or afford rent in Massachusetts right now. Next. So I just want to give you some images. And again, I'm not saying in this presentation that all of these would pencil out to being exactly 15 units an acre, but generally I want to provide some images to let people know this is the kind of housing that we're talking about in 3A. Some of these are in small adjacent communities. Some of them are in commuter rail communities. They exist all over the region now. I happen to know that the historic building up on the top in the last slide is exactly 15 units an acre, but that's because it's on a very small parcel. This is a historic building in a town common in a very rural area, but this is the kind of housing that we want to have. Okay, thanks. Next, Ganesh. So again, just some more images. Some of it is older, some of it is new. This is, again, these development types exist all over the region. Next. And I don't want to forget, who are we zoning for? We have to remember it's not just dwelling units, it's not just numbers. As much as I support data-driven policymaking, we have to remember that we have to house people in Massachusetts. We have to house the very elderly. We have to house teachers. We have to house families of all sizes, roommates, single parents, people who are aging in place. These are all the folks that need housing in Massachusetts. Next. All right, so sit back. I'm going to talk about some of the basic requirements. First of all, there has to be, and these are really reflecting the compliance guidelines. So we took 3 paragraphs and we wrote 18 pages of single space guidelines. They articulate the zoning district that allows multifamily as of right, that there's a minimum gross density of 15 units an acre, and gross density is in the statute. I did not make it up, I did not write it, but I have to implement it. It has to be suitable for families with children, should be near transit where applicable. And also we have added kind of where development is feasible. So we're not trying to drive development to wetlands that surround a commuter rail station. It should be suitable for multifamily development. Generally, for reasonable size, we have a placeholder of 50 acres, some are less. We've created a concept called unit capacity, or actually, to use Amy's words, I really like zoning capacity, but unit capacity is the technical term in the guidelines. And I'm going to talk about this more, but that's based on community category and existing housing units. So that's a new metric that all these communities must meet. And then non-compliance makes communities ineligible for Mass Works, Housing Choice Grant Program, and the Local Capital Projects Fund. Next. So this is a slide with lots of information on it. And so again, I'm not going to try and go over all of it, but as you look at this slide deck in the future, you might want to refer to it. This has all the 4 community categories and some of the key metrics associated with it, such as the minimum land area. You'll notice that adjacent small towns do not have a minimum land area. The unit capacity, which again, we have said that, the more transit you have, the more unit capacity you should have. If there's a location requirement, and then the deadline for compliance. So again, our 12 rapid transit communities are working hard to complete compliant districts by the end of this calendar year, and the other categories have extended times. Next. So now I'm going to just talk about some of these general categories. Reasonable size, and I like this picture. Boston is actually not part of the MBTA community, so I don't want to confuse anybody, but I find that if you didn't know this is something I've learned, the Boston Common, not including the public garden, is exactly 50 acres. And this is something I think many people are familiar with, and they've been there, they've walked it. You can kind of have a sense of what it's like. For those of us in the planning world, we may have used a football field is approximately 1 acre. And so I think it's handy to kind of help people understand general sizes. Next. We're going to talk a little bit about unit capacity. And again, we're going to have questions at the end. But unit capacity, as articulated in the guidelines and in the compliance model, which is a tool that I'll talk about in a little bit, that allows communities to actually calculate the unit capacity, their total district size, and other key metrics. But let's just take this one parcel as an example of how the compliance model derives this estimate of capacity. We take it, and it's a parcel by parcel analysis. So each parcel is looked at. Does not matter what's on the parcel now. You can have, so this example has a duplex on a unit. The compliance model will treat that as if there's no development on it, but the zoning metrics, let's say for this particular community, would allow a certain height and would allow a certain density and a certain lot coverage. And the capacity on that is actually a 4-plex. So the existing units is 2, but the unit capacity is 4. The existing development could be 100. And if the zoning only allowed 4, the unit capacity would be 4, even though there are 100 units on this parcel. That might be hard to do, but that's how that works. District location, another important requirement and metric in the compliance model. There's an important table in the guidelines called Table 2 that basically says that if you have under 100 acres of developable station area, which is a defined term in the guidelines, that you don't have a location requirement. So only communities that have more than 100 acres of developable station area kick into any requirement to locate near transit. And the more transit you have, the more of your district that has to be in a transit area. This seems fair to me. Needham is an example of a community that has tons of developable station area, over 1,200 units, and they're one of the 10 communities that has a requirement to put 90% of their district land area and unit capacity within these transit-oriented areas or half a mile from a transit station. Just for a second, let me pause on this map because it shows excluded land, which is an important concept in the guidelines. So wetlands, public land, institutions like universities and hospitals are all excluded land. So those don't count towards that developable land area. Next. We also have requirements because we want to encourage communities to develop neighborhoods and not just zone for projects. There are contiguity requirements. And in the stations, communities must have at least half of their district as contiguous. This is not half of the minimum land area, it's half of the actual district size. So for example, and we think many communities will have over 50 acres, if they have an 80-acre district, then 40 acres must be a contiguous block. And again, that is to create the concept of neighborhoods and again, especially where there's transit, to keep the districts near transit. And then we have a minimum size of at least 5 acres. So once you have your contiguous acres, the districts can be located anywhere in a community, but they have to be at least 5 acres. Next. Another important concept is as-of-right zoning. And of course, as-of-right zoning is complicated when you get into the details. We do, and the guidelines explicitly allow for site plan review. That site plan review just can't be equal to a special permit. It has to just legitimately be in a clear and objective standards and decision-making of basically up or down by a board. Mixed-use development may not be required. This is makes people unhappy. It is a planning concept that has worked to create ground floor retail, but our reading of the statute to have multifamily by right leads us to say that you cannot require ground floor retail if you're having multifamily by right. There are some workarounds for this, and I'm happy to talk more about those, but you can allow for mixed use, but not require it. And then energy efficiency, you cannot have standards that are just applied to multifamily uses in the district and not applied to all other uses. So that's energy efficiency, just has to be even throughout a community. Next. And a major topic of as-of-right zoning is how much affordability can be required. And so in October, after some comments from communities that had extensive inclusionary zoning, we did make an amendment. And this reflects the changes that we made at that time. So any inclusionary zoning that's 10% of the units at 80% of the area median income is okay in all communities. That's kind of we call that, that's a by right use, that's an as of right use. And we're protecting against overuse of inclusionary zoning that is very high number of percentage of units or very low area median income, which can be used to block multifamily development. But we've created some other paths. If you can have up to 20% of the units, if there's a DHCD approved program. If you had an existing 40R smart growth district, you can continue to maintain up to 25% of the units affordable at 80%. And then if you want to go beyond 20% is the cap, 20 or 25% if you 40R, but 20% is a cap. But if you want to have more than 10 or less than 80%, no, more than 10% of the units or less than 80% of the area median income, you can submit an economic feasibility analysis that would support that, saying that, for example, in Cambridge or Somerville, the market will carry these deeper affordability limits. And so we'll be reviewing those on a case-by-case basis. Next. Okay, just a quick walk through the compliance model. The model is available on the website for download, as are land maps for every community, for every parcel in every community. So if you want to kind of play around with this, you are welcome to. Only a community can submit a compliance application, but you may be interested in how this works. It does require GIS expertise, and that is using GIS to carve out or to designate a district, which is shown here on the left, and then export all the parcels in that district into the compliance model, which is an Excel workbook. There's a tab in the model for a zoning checklist, which walks communities through through many zoning parameters, but not all. This is just creating an estimate of unit capacity. So you put in minimum lot size, height, maximum height, density, lot coverage. So we're using some proxies for what could be developed on the site. And then that workbook will then apply those metrics to every parcel that's in your district. And on the right, you can see the summary table that if everything goes well, you can see that it'll calculate the acreage, the unit capacity, the estimated density, and if you have a station, what percentage of the land area is in the station. And so this trial balloon here, this community met all of its metrics. But if you didn't meet those, that would be a problem. Okay, sorry, Ganesh. And then finally, we're providing lots of technical assistance. We have a goal of making sure that every community has access to technical assistance through a whole variety of programs. And so towards that end, we end up doing a lot of coordination. I've listed some of the programs here that you can read later. Next. Just a couple things quickly that I want to make sure that what the 3A districts are not. It does not require that multifamily housing be built. Compliance is based on zoning. It does not compel communities to design or pay for new infrastructure. It does not mean that you have to have a uniform district at 15 units an acre. In fact, you might have sub-districts with higher and lower densities. It does not supersede environmental protections, and it does not allow for any waivers or exemptions. The guidelines are the guidelines, and you either comply or you do not. Next. And then finally, I just want to reiterate that the whole concept is to remove zoning barriers. Cities and towns are rolling up their sleeves and diving into this. You may get a different opinion from the press, but as many of you know, the press loves a car crash and they like to cover the negatives. I'm waiting for the press to cover all of the positive communities that are working hard and preparing new zoning. And just again, the capacity analysis is only an estimate. It's not a build out tool. And it doesn't mean that those things will happen immediately. As you all know, zoning just sets the table for future actions. And then I just thought I'd leave you with Professor Einstein and just, I think this very wise saying, we can't solve the problems if we're continuing to use all the things that we did in the past that created them. And here's an email address. If you do have questions about the program, you can submit it. You will not get an immediate answer, but we do endeavor to answer everything as soon as we can. Thank you, Ganesh, for sharing.
Thank you, Chris. That was like an extraordinary amount of information, so well put in such a limited amount of time. I mean, I'm glad we are recording it so folks can go back and listen to it. There is so much pertinent information here. And I think Amy is going to just tell us how we are going to do all this.
Thank you, Ganesh and Sarah, for inviting me here. And Chris, that was a phenomenal presentation. And now I'm going to screen share to bring up my PowerPoint. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Dane. I'm a consultant in public policy research and writing, and I usually work for think tanks. In 2004, I did a study of zoning regulations in 187 cities and towns of Eastern Massachusetts. And then more recently, I did a study of zoning for multifamily housing in 100 cities and towns of Greater Boston, and that report came out in 2019. And then even more recently, as Ganesh mentioned, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy hired me to write a series of articles on MBTA community zoning law. The articles ran in Commonwealth magazine this past January. And so today I'm going to give a quick review of my findings from the 2019 report and relate those to the new MBTA community zoning law that you just heard all about. As I mentioned, for the 2019 study, I reviewed zoning in 100 municipalities, but not including Boston itself. And in that research, I came to 4 key findings that I presented in all sorts of forums and webinars. But today I'm going to be adding a 5th finding, which was in the original report, but I hadn't featured it so much in past presentations. And I'll explain now why I think that finding is really important for us to pull out. So my first finding was that very little land is zoned for multifamily housing all across Greater Boston, and where it's technically allowed, it's highly restricted. Sometimes multifamily zones are built out to the capacity allowed. Sometimes the details of the regulations undermine the feasibility of projects. In my survey, I asked if the municipality allows multifamily housing at a density of 12 units per acre. Think low density multifamily housing like townhouses. More than 20 municipalities had no provisions on the books for multifamily housing at that density. This does not mean that the other 80 municipalities really allow it. They just had some provisions on the books for it. Sometimes the districts, as I mentioned, for multifamily housing are built out. Sometimes the dimensional requirements are not feasible, or the permitting processes are too unpredictable or sort of unlikely to yield a green light to projects. The MBTA community zoning law addresses the lack of zoning for multifamily housing by requiring municipalities to zone a district of reasonable size for multifamily housing at 15 units per acre, which is just slightly denser than the threshold I was researching when I did my study, but it's all missing middle housing. My second finding was that the approval process for multifamily housing has evolved to become more political, discretionary, unpredictable across the decades. Now, a lot of individual projects need approval from town meeting or city council, not just permits from a building department, or they need special permits from a planning board. It's uncommon to be able to build multifamily housing in Greater Boston as of right without public hearings and discretionary votes. The common practice has not been to zone whole districts for multifamily housing that cross many parcels, like the one in Danvers that I'm showing here, which does. Those pink parcels are where multifamily housing is allowed. The trend is to rezone parcel by parcel, project by project for multifamily housing. So Danvers here is a counterexample to the larger trend. On this list here that I showed you, Newton's not here, for example, because Newton has zoning for multifamily housing at 12 units per acre. But building multifamily housing in Newton requires a special permit approved by City Council, and often it requires rezoning by City Council as well. And Lexington was not on the list, but in Lexington, town meeting has to approve of individual multifamily developments. In most cases across the region, multifamily housing is only allowed by discretionary vote. Discretionary decision-making has an upside. It allows negotiation between the municipality and the developer, and this can lead to community benefits. So what's wrong with it? It adds costs, time, risk to the development process. It undermines a competitive development market and leads to rising home prices, among other issues. The MBTA community's zoning law addresses this by requiring municipalities to zone districts of reasonable size for multifamily housing, specifically as of right. As of right means that the permitting is not discretionary. The design of the as of right zoning rules is discretionary, but the granting of permits under the zoning is not discretionary. My third finding was that the most widespread trend in zoning for multifamily housing has been to adopt mixed use zoning for homes above shops and retail and commercial space. 83 of the 100 cities and towns had adopted mixed use zoning by 2019. On the one hand, this was a huge accomplishment. Mixed use development is great. We like to see it, and you see it in most municipalities now. As you're driving down the street or walking in a downtown, you'll often see them. On the other hand, it means that in many places, the only type of multifamily housing allowed is mixed use. Every apartment building has to have first floor retail in a lot of communities. It isn't just about mixing uses in districts, but within each building. This itself could be a barrier to housing development or an added cost to housing development where the retail market is weak. The implementation guidelines for the MBTA community's zoning law make a controversial determination about mixed use. They say that mixed use zoning, where first floor retail is required as opposed to it being an option, will not count towards the zoning capacity minimums that Chris mentioned in her presentation. Finding number 4 was that municipalities are allowing incremental development in historic centers and more on town edges, especially across the highway from the rest of the municipality. Needham is an example in my study, and Chris highlighted Needham as well. So we could overlay this slide with hers that have the walk sheds of the train stations. And the 3 stars on the edge of town were big developments that aren't in those walk sheds, I think, that she highlighted. So Needham permitted 10 units in the historic downtown before my study, and hundreds of units along Route 128 on the edge of the municipality. And this is a pattern I see like all across the region. The MBTA community zoning law addresses this issue by mandating zoning for multifamily housing near stations where possible. Many stations are in historic centers and downtowns. Okay, so this gets us to the 5th finding, which I hadn't pulled out in past presentations, and I'm now realizing is like really important. So most municipalities are systematically and deliberately prohibiting construction of multifamily housing for families with children. More than half of the municipalities I looked at have adopted zoning for age-restricted housing. More than a quarter of the municipalities had zoning that restricted the number of bedrooms that could be included in at least some kinds of multifamily housing. Municipalities usually zone more liberally for age-restricted housing and often offer incentives for development of age-restricted housing, for example, allowing more dwelling units to be included in exchange for age restrictions. It's also really critical to understand that the restrictions do not need to be on the books to be enforced. They don't have to be in zoning. So if I say that half have adopted age-restricted zoning, it doesn't mean that this isn't enforced in other communities as well. As long as the permitting is discretionary, builders will understand that projects designed with fewer bedrooms and with age restrictions are more likely to get permitted, and to get a green light on their project, they'll propose that. Or if it's not in the zoning, it could get negotiated through the special permit or rezoning process. So at first, I had this in my study, it was sort of buried in there. I was thinking of age-restricted and bedroom-restricted zoning, as a pressure valve. It's hard to get municipalities to allow multifamily housing for families. So at least we should allow developers to build senior housing. It's better to zone 55 plus than no multifamily housing at all. And also, people who move out of single family houses into senior villages free up single family homes for families. And this is good for seniors and this is good for families. So like, really, what's the problem with this? And I was thinking it's maybe not that big an issue that we need to spotlight it as a key finding. I've changed my mind on that. Our Federal Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination based on family status. Using municipal laws or public laws to systematically keep multi-generational families that need rental housing out of suburbs is not just bad policy, it's an injustice. In 2003, before I even did my first zoning study, a CHAPA report, CHAPA's a housing organization, concluded, we find that most of the Commonwealth's new multifamily developments have generated little, if any, impact on public schools.
Did we lose Amy?
Just frozen?
I mean, it's snowing like crazy outside, so won't be surprised. But can you hear me and see me okay?
I can see you and hear you. Oh, there she's back.
Okay.
Amy, just from the top of this slide.
Oh, you didn't hear me for the whole slide?
You froze just, I think, for most of it.
Okay, so I'll repeat the whole slide and be quick because I know we're running out of time. 2003 CHAPA report concluded that we find that most of the Commonwealth's new multifamily developments have generated little, if any, impact on the public schools because with rare exception, they were designed to be childproof. And just was spotlighting some senior housing in my own neighborhood that was approved in the 1990s where there used to be like a vacant factory. And it's just politically to get senior housing through as possible to get that same multifamily project with housing that families with children could live in. It's politically really hard all across the region. So the MBTA communities zoning law addresses this by requiring municipalities to zone for multifamily housing without age restrictions, without bedroom restrictions, and as of right, which is so important and where it all ties back together about why that as of right is so important. If it's discretionary, it doesn't matter if you've got the age restrictions, you're not going to get family suitable housing. And I just wanted to emphasize that if you take out the age restrictions from the zoning, a developer can still build senior housing. It's not prohibiting senior housing. If there's a market for senior housing, the senior housing will be built. If there's a market for multifamily housing that's suitable for families with 3 bedrooms and whatnot, that housing will get built under the new zoning rules. So these really address an important injustice that has been in our public laws for decades. And I wanted to just make some closing comments to remind us all that people need housing. And we are in this because shelter is a fundamental need of humanity. And the politics and the planning is really hard, but we are up for the task. And that was both a lot of information and also just barely skimming the surface of these topics. So I hope we can talk more. And I also just wanted to mention that you can find my reports and articles on my website if you want to dig deeper into the research that I'm doing and hear more, read more about my thoughts on it all. Here's my email address. Feel free to take a screenshot of it. If you'd like to follow up, feel free to email me. Also, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. And that is my presentation. Thanks. And I will stop the screen share.
Very good. And just note, Ganesh, I shared, Amy had shared some useful links and resources I just posted to the chat, and we can share those on our website after when we post the recording as well.
Great. That was terrific. Like, let me kick off with one question, a big picture. You know, is this really a big deal? And why do you, and the answer could be no or yes, and why do you think this is a big deal, this rollout? I think it's a question for both of you.
I'll start. Yeah, sure. Yes, it is absolutely a big deal. It's a really big deal. First of all, these communities, the 177 is half of the Massachusetts cities and towns. While it doesn't cover, geographically half, it does, it is the greater Boston region. And it is my sincere hope that this, rezoning, again, I talk about success, like what is success for this program? Success is going to be as many as possible. I'm not going to give a percentage, but as many communities as possible adopt by right multifamily districts. And that, I hope, over time will change the market, because the market is one of the problems that we have right now with the high expense of housing. And so that is my hope, in addition to creating and production of multifamily. But I think the first thing that will happen is it may change the market. So community development corporations or others looking to purchase land zoned for multifamily have a better chance of doing that.
I definitely agree. It's a big deal. And it's really a big deal grounded in this research that it's asking cities and towns to zone in a way that they haven't been zoning, to zone districts of reasonable size for multifamily housing at 15 units per acre as of right, without age restrictions, and pretty much none of those components are widespread practices right now. So it's asking cities and towns to get together and change that. It's also important that this model is not saying that the state is rezoning for you or going to directly allow. The model is to say that cities and towns need to get together and have a good amount of flexibility to think about where should multifamily housing be allowed, what are the rules for it to be developed within the framework. They have some flexibility on densities and how they'll meet those requirements. So that's going to, be some hard work at the local level. Rezoning is always controversial. So you're always on these, in these efforts can have people who are coming out against and for, and it's neighbors arguing with each other. I think it's challenging to take it on, but it's really important work and definitely a big deal.
Amy, I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to open it up to the audience. And Sarah, if you have any questions.
Yeah,
so David is asking, can you speak to why communities, okay, you could probably see the chat, but I'm going to read it out. Why communities have historically imposed age restrictions and the politics around schools and tax revenues?
Yeah, so I would say that I did my 2 studies, and the 2004 study, I found a lot of recommendations in the local master plans to adopt age-restricted zoning. I found in my more recent study, there weren't as many recommendations for it because I think that a lot of planners, due to a lot of advocacy by pro-housing advocates and abundant housing advocates, that it is an injustice. So in the recent plans, the reasons for it weren't as much articulated, but in the plans that I looked at going back to like 2000, the late 1990s, the recommendations were saying that it can have positive fiscal impacts because you have the tax revenues from that housing without expenditures on the schools. There were also often mentions that you have less driving at rush hour from seniors. That was just something written out in the plans. And then of course, there's often concern put forward about if children living in multifamily development will sort of tip the scale to need new schools to be built. And then that's obviously like a big deal for a community. And I mean, that's why CHAPA did that 2003 report to see, is multifamily housing having an effect on the schools and school capacity? But then they realized like, we couldn't really figure that out because kids aren't allowed in multifamily housing. So they're not having an effect. My own sense is that if you really liberally allowed multifamily housing to allow children in it, especially in the communities with the best schools, you will get some more multifamily housing that has some kids in it. And I think that that's our mandate, is to plan for growth and plan for kids in places that have good schools. And it's a tough job, but that's sort of the job we're all here for. And I also think about like the 1950s and 60s when suburban growth was so intense and families were moving to the suburbs that like didn't have the school capacity. And, it's a bit of a crisis and you have to find ways to solve it and to build the schools where you need them. But right now, a lot of communities actually do have capacity in their schools to accommodate additional kids. And in some places, and I shouldn't speak to them, not like a demographic, that's not my focus of my expertise, but in some places where kids have gone to private schools during the pandemic and stayed, there may be some more capacity in the public schools, and then better to have kids coming in than to be closing schools or dealing with that.
Go ahead.
I just want to add that there's some myths around school and school enrollment that I think need some correction. And one of them is that school enrollment comes from multifamily. And again, this is in part because of the kind of intense outreach and town meeting format kind of government, for example, where you have citizens who are debating things and they don't know all the facts. In fact, school enrollment generally comes from turnover of single family homes. Families generally move into single family homes when a family that has no kids moves out and a family with kids moves in. Those are facts. The other thing is, as Amy started to mention, school enrollment generally is declining, and this is part of my expertise. And so while there are some magnet school districts that of course are always high enrollment gleaners, many, just the demographic trends are that school enrollments are going down. And when I was a planning director in a community, it was actually the school committee that said, we want new multifamily because otherwise we have to consolidate and close one of our elementary schools. So they're just, sometimes the facts are avoided in these discussions.
So I have a question from Andrea. It's, why is Boston exempt? And do you have a pushback from other towns? Like, why are we kind of supporting what, Boston's housing pressures in our little towns? Do you face that kind of a pushback?
There's a variety of pushback. Boston is not included because they have their own zoning statute. So they're not subject to the Zoning Act, which is Chapter 40A, and this requirement is in Chapter 40A. So it was very clear from the get-go, Boston was not intended to be included. If they were, we would have also amended their district, their zoning, but that was not amended. And so that's why. Do we get pushback? Well, I think one of the things is that Boston, actually, if you look at the production numbers, Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, Watertown have been the producers of multifamily housing, and it's really others that need to step up. And it's been very, I think there's about 10 communities that have done over 50% of all multifamily in the entire state over the last decade. So there has been just disproportionate multifamily construction in the inner core.
So here's a question from Ben Carlson. In MBTA communities, are you seeing any trends of municipal planners or their resident stakeholders requesting or planning additional transit services or other multimodal infrastructure to improve access options in the TOD areas?
I'm sure, we do hear from communities with, complaints about commuter rail service not being active enough, about bus service and the new bus redesign that the MBTA has gone on. One of the reasons that we dropped an entire category of communities, which we call bus communities, was because kind of recognizing, with the exception of the bus rapid transit lines, bus lines are not fixed transit assets. And so we decided to focus on those fixed transit assets. But I would say, so I am a regular commuter rail rider, and, it's only once an hour, but it's many, many times a day, and it is certainly usable. But yes, of course, we do see some complaints about the MBTA service, and we work closely with the T to kind of coordinate our efforts. There are many new stations that are coming online that are included in this, including South Coast Rail. So you heard me talk about Fall River and New Bedford. That's a whole bunch of new transit costing billions of dollars that's just been invested by the Commonwealth.
I have a question. I've been in this field both as an advocate and as a consultant for a while, and the challenge always is how to translate these numbers, density numbers, into what are you going to see in reality? That's why your slide showing that house that's 15 dwelling units an acre is so powerful, because it just looks like something that was built a while back. And I wonder if DHCD is working on a companion document or anything that can help kind of simplify some of these dense, no pun intended, guidelines into something that is easily communicable to the stakeholders, the town meeting members you are talking about, and the neighbors.
Thanks, Ganesh. Yes, we do intend. We're just very busy, and we're a very small but mighty group. And so we're working with people like Amy, who's been really helpful. The articles that she wrote for Commonwealth, are wonderful and put things into more layperson language. Again, I did reference the 18-page single space guidelines, which was written by an attorney, and definitely needs translation. So slide decks like this, which is as we've moved from action plans into implementation, we're focusing a little bit more on what's the process to what's the outcome. So your point is well taken, and I am not an architect, but we are going to work to create more illustrations. And I don't know if there's anybody here from the press, but the press keeps putting 40 units an acre in every picture that's on MBTA communities, and it's totally different density.
No,
But
that's why
insist
the
on those
missing middle
photographs.
graphic is so powerful. That's like, I have seen that in so many presentations I have used myself, and it really tells the story of the aspiration. So another question from Greg. I know some communities in South Shore and looking at moving their train stations into downtown so that they can use the MBTA communities rezoning to do the long sought changes to their downtown. I think it's more of a comment than a question. Any other questions?
I just
What
I want to quickly add that the issue of translating the complicated regulations into stuff that people who've never read a zoning bylaw or ordinance can understand is really what animates my work. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how to explain it, writing articles, and I'm really happy for the support from different think tanks to do that work, to help get the news out and make presentations and do the writing.
Ganesh, if I could just comment on Greg's comment. We do try in the guidelines, and I think this is one of the mischaracterizations. People kind of get obsessed with the fact that they're transit-oriented development, but the guidelines do provide for flexibility. You saw that table 2, which had a variety of percentages in it. Only the communities with lots and lots of transit station area that's developable have to really push the districts there. So we are hoping to make sure people understand that you don't have to put all of the district next to the train station. Some of those areas are constrained. Some of them we really want mandatory mixed use, other reasons. So the guidelines do allow for this other locations for districts. And I hope people understand that. That's one of the things I have to work hard on when I talk to elected officials. They're like, oh, but I have to put it all in the train station. I'm like, no, not only in some areas. And then you have, if you're like Needham or Newton, you have got a lot of train stations to pick from.
Some of this is a branding issue, that it was called smart growth for a time, 15-minute cities, new urbanism, sustainable development, transit-oriented development. And I heard in Newtonville, where the city of Newton is looking to rezone its village centers, and people have come to hearings saying okay, we have a train station here, but the development here is not transit-oriented development because few of the residents in the new apartment buildings are actually taking the train to work. But it's classic transit-oriented development, and the concept of transit-oriented development that advocates in this space think of it as having development in places where people don't need their car to do everything that they want to do. So you could take the train, but people in those apartment buildings for sure, walking to the bank and to the restaurants and cafes and to friends' houses. I know some of the residents and I see them out doing all of those things, and actually fewer people in those apartment buildings have cars than they had expected. There are empty parking spaces because they're not just driving everywhere, and you can live in those apartments without even having to have a car.
That's great. Well, and I think it looks like we're kind of wrapping up on questions. And so one thing, not to end necessarily on a negative note, but I'm curious, Chris, and Amy, we've seen a handful of press about communities that are non-compliant, but do not feel that the being non-compliant is an issue, right? So their understanding is that they don't tend to utilize either the state or federal funding that would be restricted if they're out of compliance with this. And so what might you say or suggest is there is the incentive to kind of get communities on board with this on kind of a municipal level? Because I mean, to an extent, I think you're preaching to the choir of a lot of planners and architects who are excited about it, but how do we sort of help or bring kind of context to communities that say, oh, it doesn't matter and we don't need their money anyway?
Sure. Well, it's certainly our position that the law is a mandate and that the law does require, it uses the word shall, every MBTA community shall have a multifamily district. It does give penalties, and at some point this may be resolved in litigation, but it is our position that it is required and that everybody should be adopting these districts. The Attorney General has indicated in an interview that she intends to issue an advisory opinion. And so I am waiting for that advisory opinion, which I think may be shed some light about her understanding of the requirements and the legal ramifications. Lawyers for Civil Rights is a nonprofit group that did contact the 4 communities that did not submit action plans and sent them letters indicating that they thought they may be in violation of fair housing laws. So people are being put on notice, as Amy used the word injustice. People are being put on notice about, what might be other ramifications of noncompliance. I'm not an attorney, so I don't try and predict, how litigation will go. But there has been some pushback, I guess I would say, from the legal community about that. I do want to just, and there's been some chat about the ground floor retail, and I wanted to say that generally, yes, Diana Marsh says that there can be additional density bonuses, for example, or other incentives that could allow for mixed-use development. We are soon going to be issuing sample zoning that will be posted on the website, and the sample zoning will talk about that in detail and give some suggestions about how to handle that. So I'm sorry, Sarah, to take up your time, but that's a really important issue for many communities, so I wanted to cover that.
No, I appreciate it, and I do. There's a little bit more questions, but I also wanted to leave us just a minute to wrap up. And thank our guests today and share some BSA Housing Committee news. So thank you so much, Chris and Amy, for joining us. And Ganesh, do you have any other closing? Yeah.
So Sarah, boy, you were doing a great job. Why don't you?
I'll roll it up here. Well, so thanks to everybody, first of all, for coming to the first housing event this year. So I wanted to let folks know we're intending to have a follow-up meeting in April. We're going to use that as a planning meeting for the BSA Housing Committee to think about events for the rest of the year, as well as we are looking for a co-host to join me as Ganesh, I don't know, retires from hosting. I don't know.
No, I think I'm end of my 3-year shared term. So yeah.
We're looking for fresh blood, let's say. So if anyone is interested or would like to know more about what that is and the what we try to do with the committee every year, please leave a note for one of us. You can email us and find our contact information. I'm also putting it right in the chat. So I think that's it. The recording of this event will be available on BSA. It's architects.org and then Housing Committee later this in the next couple of weeks to commemorate the event and
yeah, once again, thank you, Chris and Amy. This was such a great, compliment of presentation. And I have a feeling we are going to be seeing both of you in other forums as well, because we know that this is a big deal.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.